Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing the meeting that Angela Merkel held while she was in the United States, her final trip to the U.S. as the German Chancellor, as she's on her way out of that office soon. Now, on the agenda, one of the major things on the agenda, and certainly there were quite a few important issues on the agenda that affect U.S.-German relations, but that was Russia. And both sides did agree that Russia needs to be, in their words at least, contained. They spoke about the Russian aggression from Moscow as well, and there was no disagreement in that regard. But the one major area of disagreement, and this has been an area of disagreement for a significant amount of time now, is that over the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline. The Americans for a while now have had complaints against that, saying that this would affect the energy security of the Europeans overall, and that Russia would have much too much leverage over the Europeans if this then pipeline becomes functional. It's pretty much already complete, an $11 billion project, and so obviously Germany is not in the mood to walk away from this at this time, certainly, and this will very likely go ahead, as Biden has also mentioned. Are all the fatalistic presumptions about this true at this time vis-a-vis Russia and its energy control over Europe? Let's discuss that as well as the other issues that I mentioned with Gianfranco Pasquino, who is an emeritus professor of political science from the University of Bologna. He's joining us today from Bologna. Gianfranco, thank you very much for taking your time out to speak to us this Saturday. What do you make of, firstly, the agreement on the part of the Germans and the Americans that there is Russian aggression and that is something of concern?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. Well, it was necessary to renew an agreement between Germany and the US after Donald Trump's presidency. Biden is signaling that he wants to have a good relationship with Europe, the European Union, and the Germans especially. There will be no European Union without Germany, of course. So what they've said and done appears to me in a very positive light, in a very favorable light. Russia is indeed a problem. Russia is a problem, first of all, let me put it this way, for the Russians themselves, for the Russian citizens who are deprived of their liberties. But it may be a problem also for the countries surrounding Russia, and then, of course, for the European Union as such. It is not an easy problem to solve.
And then there is then this huge reality of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. It will be, according to many, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, extremely beneficial to the Europeans. I know for a while, especially under Donald Trump, there was an effort by the Americans to try to sell their own LNG, to the Europeans, which from what I've understood was a lot more expensive than the Russian energy that is being supplied. What do you make of that? I mean, do you think that this is really just a business deal, for the lack of a better word, and that this will not then be as politically negative as many are presuming?
No, I don't think it will be very negative from a political point of view. It is obvious that the Germans and the Europeans need different sources of energy, and the Russian gas is useful. It is also not very expensive, but Europe has already started a green transition, so it will try to make less use of that gas. Will be probably trying to produce energy through other sources. For the time being, I mean, we must accept realpolitik. We must accept that the Russian gas, the Nord Stream, is necessary and useful. We have to use other means if we want to put pressures on the Russians. And I think that we have other means to do that.
This question of, Gianfranco, the fact that clearly the Europeans are geographically a lot closer to Russia, and so anything related to Russia affects Europe several-fold more than it would affect the Americans, right? I mean, I'm speaking just if something were to happen on the ground. So now, do you think that differentiates in the calculus on the part of both sides, and that sometimes then creates friction, where I would think that the Americans would want the Europeans to take a much stronger stance on any given issue, and the Europeans may want to take a much more muted stance and or much more well thought out stance, considering anything untoward that would happen would affect Europe a lot more?
Obviously, I mean, Russia is very close to Europe. Russia, in fact, is a European country. At least for one third of its territory, it is located in Europe geographically. You may recall that long time ago, Mitterrand said, when asked about the borders of Europe, said from the Atlantic to the Urals, and therefore he was including one third of the Russian territory in Europe. Russia is an important trade partner. We cannot forget that. It is an important trade partner for the European Union as such, as well as for Italy, if I can mention my own country. We have to try to change the policies of Russia vis-à-vis the citizens, liberties, freedoms, and so on. But this cannot be done just simply by stopping any kind of relationship with Russia, by having a sort of trade war. This will not work, and if it works to the worse, to worsen the situation of Russian citizens, and not necessarily of Putin and his circle of powerful elites. So this we must be very cautious, very tentative in producing a Russian policy.
Let's for a moment just shift our focus, if we can, Gianfranco, to just the relations between Germany and the U.S. as well as Europe, I mean, as a whole, and the U.S. Because Donald Trump was this huge wave, I think, that hit the relations, right? Almost like a tidal wave, and a lot of people say there was some irreversible damage that was done to the relations between the two sides. You know, the way that Donald Trump would even address Merkel sometimes, in the sense, you know, criticizing her in more public ways than I would imagine is diplomatically seen as acceptable or as diplomatic etiquette. Do you think that we are at a very different place now in European-American relations? Merkel, I'm using just an example because she's such a powerhouse in Europe.
Well, first of all, let me say that I do not want to comment on what Trump has done, what Trump has said. It was a very dark period in U.S. history. The sooner we forget it, the sooner we overcome it, the better, of course. The problem is that Angela Merkel is the outgoing Chancellor of Germany. So she was probably also saying farewell to Biden. She was probably explaining to Biden that the transition from her own chancellorship to another chancellor who may not be necessarily a Christian Democrat will have some problems. There will be some difficulties. But she wanted to assure Biden that Germany is a politically stable country, is a reliable ally, and she wanted to have from Biden the assurance, the reassurance that Biden will remain interested in what goes on in Europe and that will remain helpful when necessary to the Europeans. I would say that this has been accomplished, but then, of course, the way things will develop will tell us more. We do not know. We have to wait until the end of September to see who will become the Chancellor of Germany, and of course, this will make a very important difference.
As a final, and then before I let you go, Gianfranco, let's look to the future then. As you correctly pointed out, we still have to wait and see who will become the chancellor in Germany, and that is a wait-and-see game. But nevertheless, Europe is also changing, right? We have had, during the pandemic and before the pandemic as well, significant, important rise of the far-right parties. I know that's a very general term that I'm using, but in respective contexts of these individual European countries, we've had that in the past. We've also had migrant crisis that has slowed significantly of recent, but nevertheless, those issues have changed Europe overall. Does that then change how Europe then deals with its allies, friends, and then there's NATO thrown into the mix with the Americans trying to push for more NATO budget on the part of Europeans as well?
On the whole, Europe is politically stable. The European Union is working reasonably well to the satisfaction of most Europeans. There are challenges, of course. However, what is very interesting and important is that there is now an economic recovery. that many European countries have received a lot of money from the European Commission, and they will start the recovery. Italy is doing very well from that point of view. The real problem remains the health problem. The virus remains alive and we said, well, if you allow me this kind of irony, alive and well in Europe. But again, we have found a way to fight against the virus. This is the emergency, which is no longer an emergency because we know now that it's going to last at least for the next 6-8 months. And the second problem is indeed the transition to the green economy that may produce very good results in the long run, but is expensive in the short run. And of course, it goes against entrenched interest. On the whole, I would say that if Biden pursues his economic policy, his foreign policy towards the European Union, it will be very helpful to Europe. But Europe, the Europeans have a lot of resources, and I'm pretty sure, I'm very confident that they will know how to use them in a more than satisfactory way.
Much, Gianfranco. We really appreciate you taking your time out this Saturday to speak to us there from Bologna in Italy. That was Gianfranco Pasquino, Emeritus Professor of Political Science at the University of Bologna, who was sharing his expertise with us, contextualizing relations not just between the United States and Germany, but Europe as a whole and the United States as well. And we spoke in detail there about Russia because that's an important point of disagreement and agreement, depending on which aspects of the relations with Russia and Europe you look at. So Nord Stream 2, a point of disagreement. The Americans did not want that gas pipeline to go through. It is nevertheless going through. But as Gianfranco there said, the huge reality is that Europe is becoming more green. And so how much longer will Russia really have that sort of influence? And I mean, was this $11 billion pipeline even worth it? Possibly it was, but we'll have to wait and see, certainly. And the American, doomsday scenario of Russians having huge leverage over the Europeans, again, that's also a wait and see game once this is operational, and we'll have to wait and see then how the European and Russian trade or relations then go forward in that regard. I'll be back with my next segment after this break. Welcome back. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi, and in this segment, we're going to discuss a really important ruling which has come out of the European Court of Justice, the ECJ. This is a case that two German Muslim women had brought forth against their respective employers. They had been sacked for the fact that they wore and they still wear headscarves. Now, initially, German courts had found that what had happened to them was in breach of the Constitution, that it was against their religious freedoms. But then the ECJ has said, in fact, that employers in Europe do, in certain cases, have the right to, in fact, ensure that a quote-unquote image of neutrality is maintained. And so, at least within the court's eyes, that seemingly the message is then headscarves are not an image of neutrality, and then an employer would then be right to fire someone or ask a woman to remove her headscarf, either or, depending on whether or not they want to remain employed or not. Now, this is certainly worrying because then this means and opens a Pandora's box really across Europe and the European Union more specifically about how then Muslim women are to then be part of the workforce overall. And what does this then mean for other minorities? Because it's not like it's just Muslim women in headscarves that is a symbol of Islam, for example. We also have Sikh turbans, and we have crosses, the Jewish skull cap, et cetera, et cetera. Does this mean we're now entering on a slippery slope where other minorities, other ethnicities, other faiths will also then be targeted in the near future? Let's discuss all of those issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Aaliya Goyal, who is a general practitioner and a family doctor working in the NHS. She's joining us today from Birmingham. Also joining us from Birmingham is Asma Nafees, who is an associate director within the NHS and a solicitor. Asma and Aaliya, thank you both for taking your time out to join us this Saturday. Aaliya, I'd like to start with you. What do you think the message is right now to employers, specifically when it comes to then this phrase that the court has used, the image of neutrality that must be maintained?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. With regards to the court's image of neutrality, I think it's really important to appreciate that the ruling says that the justification needs to be linked to a genuine need. I think and this is within private businesses, so it's going to be quite difficult I feel it's going to be quite difficult for employers to be able to say that that an image of neutrality is required for the servicing of their business. And for me, it speaks more to wider issues regarding the issues of Islamophobia, racism and misogyny, which is sweeping throughout Europe.
And Asma, what are your thoughts on that? Because as Aaliya there said, yes, correctly, and I'm glad she gives that clarification about, of course, the fact that it probably will be tough even for employers within this, at least legally. The court hasn't given them carte blanche in this case, but nevertheless, the underlying message is still a worrying one for Muslim women in the workforce.
I'd agree. I think I agree with Dr. Ali, that wording of image of neutrality is so subjective and it is potentially open to abuse. So what's on the one side, there's how will employers be able to demonstrate that the image of neutrality is needed for their specific business. Equally, the other side is it is open to abuse by employers where actually it doesn't impact, but you create a thin line. I think there's great difficulty in having a defined term image of neutrality that can be interpreted so broadly.
Yes. So Aaliya, going forward then, what do you think then right now Muslim women in many positions across Europe are probably thinking regarding their headscarves? And what do you think the conversations may be like at this point? Because, at least what I was reading on and what I've read into this is that we're talking about people who, for example, are front-facing staff, right? So we're talking about people who are, for example, in sales. And I'm just using it as an example. I'm sure there are many other deeper examples as well that can be brought forth. But if somebody is working in sales and she chooses to then wear a headscarf, does that in any way, do you think, hurt a respective company's image when it comes to maintaining neutrality? I mean, it's not like she is forcing her faith onto anybody.
Yes, no, absolutely, completely agree. I mean, in terms of the conversations of Muslim women, I think that legislation such as this undoes decades of struggle for Muslim women. My concern is that these kind of policies, prohibiting religious dress, they do kind of seek to exclude Muslim women from public life or at least render them invisible. As you've quite rightly pointed out, the key messages around people who are public facing. And so does that mean that Muslim women such as myself, such as Asma, are now, confined to the back offices, so we're not allowed to play a part in public life? We must remember that a lot of the countries across Europe have large Muslim populations, and certainly should this be enforced or allowed by any individual employer, then I'm sure that will create its own kind of the own kind of repercussion in terms of the way the business manages its customers and profits ultimately.
Asma, whenever we're discussing any form of limits on a woman's choice to wear the hijab or not, or the veil or not, then it always strikes me that in the same breath, and there's always talk about the fact on the part of many, and I'm not trying to say everybody, but a lot of people, that the headscarf is oppressive, and then they want to free women, right? But then, as Aaliya there mentioned, if you're in fact stopping women from even being part of the workforce, as in women in scarves, and that sort of defeats your entire narrative about wanting to give these women freedom.
Exactly. I think if you define forcing women to wear the headscarf as oppressive, equally stopping somebody from wearing a headscarf is equally as oppressive. And I think we're unpicking decades worth of work. So Aaliya and I work in senior leadership within the NHS. We are proud to be there with our hijabs. There's never been any exclusion of us due to the headscarf. There are slightly different perceptions, but we've worked hard. I'd say certainly in the last decade, I have seen attitudes change to diversity, and this ruling seeks to undo all of that good work.
Yeah, and I would think then, Aaliya, more than the legal framework here, this then gives those who have always wanted to limit the hijab, so for example, in places like France, probably a lot more fodder, right? Where they then feel like, hey, they've gotten the green light to take it a step further.
Absolutely, I think that the way that these things are managed from the top, feeds into people feeling justified on the ground to continue this religious and gender-based inequality, which is terrible for our Muslim women, particularly because seeing Muslim women such as myself, such as Asma, we are role models also for our generations as well, and we also worry about the message that it's sending out to our girls as they're growing up about how much they are valued.
Yeah, and Asma, I wonder then, this is also a slippery slope, as I mentioned in my introduction, right? So what happens to a Muslim woman today because of her respective headscarf may very well then tomorrow happen to a Sikh man who is wearing a turban, may very well even happen to a Jewish person who chooses to wear a skull cap, or the list is really endless here, right? Do you think there's a realization on the part of Europeans that this is very, very dangerous territory?
Probably not. I think due to the deep ingrained Islamophobia that we're seeing at the moment, people probably don't realize that they see something that will impact Muslims only. But as you say, this is far reaching. This goes even far beyond religious dominations when you start dictating what people can and can't wear. Here in the UK, we have police officers who wear hijabs, who wear turbans. In the army, they've designed a special hard hat for men who wear turbans. So this is an unpicking of all of that, and it's going to have far-reaching consequences.
Yeah, and Aaliya, when we're talking then, for example, about the consequences of this, do you think that this is the time then to obviously then unite as different people of different faiths and ethnicities? Are you seeing that? Are those conversations already happening, or is this sort of gone under the radar? Because to the best of my knowledge at this point in time, it's been essentially just a conversation about Islamophobia, which is certainly very pertinent and important and completely justified. But as I said, this could very easily affect others if these courts choose to go down that route.
So yeah, again, you make a really excellent point around the fact that other people are also involved, such as Sikh gentlemen who wear the turbans, Jewish gentlemen who wear the kippah. Certainly in the UK, the whole narrative around Black Lives Matter and the understanding of different diverse communities has actually caused a lot of people to come together. So there are a lot of staff networks, there are a lot of groups of people who are fighting for a common cause. And those groups, they consist of Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Jewish people, all working together because one person's struggle is everyone's struggle. And one of the advantages of networks such as that and the greater awareness is that I genuinely believe that there are strength in numbers, and that we can all help each other. Because this legislation, I believe, kind of contradicts legislation that's already out there, I do think that any employer that enforces this will have to be very careful, because there's always I believe there will likely be test cases to see if this is actually actionable in practice.
Asma, I'm going to ask you a very open-ended question as the final one before I let both of you go. But do you think that the hijab in any way stops a Muslim woman, such as yourself and Aaliya, or others in different fields, apart from the NHS, of course? I'm sure there were some women in many, many fields across Europe. Does this in any way hinder them from doing their jobs?
Absolutely not. For anybody looking in on us, we perform, we functioned, we work in exactly the same way as our peers who do not wear a hijab, as our male counterparts. And to put so much emphasis on, for those who are non-Muslim, for them it's a piece of cloth on the head, to put so much emphasis on something that is just a piece of cloth for others is ridiculous. I know so many very, very successful women in incredibly different sectors within the UK that are performing successfully. They happen to wear a hijab. Hijab does not impact on working life in any way.
Very well. We'll leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Aaliya and Asma for taking their time out this Saturday to discuss this with us. As we discussed there with both of our experts, this ruling, it's less, in fact, about what the legal terminology says, because yes, as Aaliya there had correctly mentioned in her first answer, the details here are important to look into. It's not going to be easy for an employer to convince courts that because they need to maintain a certain image of neutrality, in their words, that a Muslim woman in a scarf cannot then fit into that image of neutrality. Nevertheless, so the message, the overall message then being sent is one that, hey, it is time then to go after Muslim women who have gotten to these places and these workplaces and have gained this respect after a very, very hard-fought battle, and battles, in fact, several battles. So what does this then mean for those Muslim women who are currently in the workforce going forward, especially those who are, yes, front-facing staff? Does this mean, as our guests are alluded to, that they will be pushed to the back rooms then? And what does that then mean for representation? What does that then mean for that narrative of freeing, quote-unquote, Muslim women? I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, in this segment of today's show, we're going to discuss Cuba, and a lot's been happening there. Of course, we've had protests, and all of this, the root cause of it is an economic crisis, which has been certainly exacerbated because of the pandemic. And this is not something which is unique to Cuba, but we have had a worldwide economic crisis because of the pandemic and businesses being shut down. But in Cuba, I would think it's a lot more magnified because it has been under an embargo for so long, and it has always had that economic pressure that's existed. Now, there's been a lot of talk about what exactly this then means for the future of Cuba as far as governance goes, because we've always had, as I said, that U.S. embargo, a lot of criticism, especially, of course, from the Cuban politicians and Cuban leadership itself, of the fact that the current situation we're seeing play out vis-a-vis the crisis in the country is because of the U.S. embargo. On the other side, the criticism is that it, in fact, is the Cuban political establishment which is corrupt in and of itself and has mismanaged the situation in the country, and that is why the Cuban people are angry and are out on the streets. Who is right? And we're going to try to understand that from our guests who are joining us today from across the U.S. We're joined now by Dr. Aviva Chomsky, who is a professor of history at Salem State University. She's joining us this morning from Salem, Massachusetts. Joining us from Pensacola, Florida, is Dr. Ted Henken, who is an associate professor of sociology and Latin American studies at Baruch College at the City University of New York. And joining us from Ann Arbor, Michigan, is Dr. Silvia Pedraza, who is a professor of sociology and American culture at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Silvia, Ted, and Avi, thank you to all three of you for taking your time out this morning. Avi, let me start with you, if I may. What do you think is really at the root cause of this, right? As I said, there are two sides that are being presented. A, that the entire experiment of governance as it has been taking place in Cuba has now failed, and this proves it because the people are angry and there's a huge economic crisis. And on the other side, then there's blame on the U.S. embargo.
I don't think that we can even frame the question as an either-or question. I think posed in their most extreme forms, those two positions are both incorrect. But if we were to nuance them a little bit and also think about how they interact, they both certainly have aspects of truth. The U.S. embargo is not the only cause of Cuba's economic crisis, but certainly it has contributed to exacerbating Cuba's economic crisis. And the blockade, as they call it in Cuba, because the United States has also done a lot to try to implement it globally, has certainly contributed both to the long-term economic crisis in Cuba and also to their specific inability now to acquire everything that they need in terms of COVID prevention and vaccination campaigns. The Cuban I think that it's quite possible, and that most Cubans are critical of many actions taken by their government without moving to the extreme way that you just framed it, that the entire revolution was a failure, just as many of us in the United States are quite critical of many things that our government does. Indeed. And yet that doesn't lead us to say the United States is a failed state and should never have existed because our government does things that we don't like. I think that most Cubans are much more capable of and I think there's also an intersection between U.S. policy, an interaction between U.S. policy and Cuban government policy. That is, when the United States is explicitly aiming to overthrow the sovereign government of Cuba, to try to bring down the sovereign government of Cuba, and is funding opposition organizations that are trying to bring down the government of Cuba, That naturally, as any government in the world, is going to make them defensive and implement repressive policies that perhaps they would not be implementing if an extraordinarily powerful outside force was trying to interfere in their domestic politics.
Ted, this happens a lot, right? So when we have protests in any country which is seen as adversarial to the United States, so I'm going to use the example of Iran just for a second before we, of course, switch back to Cuba. And in Iran, if there's ever protests, it always means immediately in many people's minds that means that the Iranians want the entire government to be overthrown. Is Avi there correct? Do you think that it would be an overstatement to say that yes, Cubans are certainly angry and they have legitimate reason to be angry, but that doesn't mean they necessarily want the overthrow of their government?
I think that she framed it very well in the sense of looking for nuance and interaction between both. I mean, the purpose of the embargo is certainly to cause things like we saw on Sunday. So, and certainly under President Donald Trump, the scarcities were exacerbated at a really, really critical time with COVID and economic, crisis. I think, however, that the person on the street in Cuba, although they have very likely participated in marches and protests in the past called by the government against the U.S. embargo, this was a spontaneous, viral protest island-wide that was sparked and fueled by access to the internet, because the Cuban government has practiced a systematic information blockade within the island, and that has started to crumble, to erode, going back a few years, especially starting in December of 2018, when Cubans began to get access on their cell phones to mobile data and could share information among themselves. There's not so much information they're getting from outside of Cuba, but information that they have that they can't share. Also, people in Cuba have long been afraid of repression from their government, of the consequences of speaking out and sharing their criticisms publicly.
All right.
So they often fall in line, even though they don't think that. Well, on Sunday, they were able to overcome that fear collectively, at least for a day, until the government brutally cracked down, and the president of Cuba called on revolutionaries to take to the streets and essentially to attack the peaceful protesters.
So what are your thoughts then on what's happening on the ground in Cuba? As in, is this a situation where, as Ted there mentioned, of repression on the part of the government?
There is no doubt that there is repression on the part of the government. I think if you listen to what people are saying on the streets, I think you can see that they hold up signs that say Patria y Vida. Patria y Vida is the name of a very, very popular song that was just written recently by 4 Afro-Cuban young men, both in the island and in Miami. And the words of Patria y Vida take off from the old motto of Fidel Castro that was always saying Patria o muerte, meaning fatherland or death. Patria y Vida means fatherland and life, okay? And essentially the song is telling everybody, and you can see people holding up the signs saying Patria y Vida, the song is telling everybody that they're tired of communism, that they're tired of being lied to, that they're tired of being told that everything is due to the embargo and that the government is at fault for the precarity of their lives.
Avi, when we talk about Cuba, there's a lot of talk about the fact that, as I said in my intro too, and as I know you've already addressed, but there's just a lot of talk about the fact that this system has not worked for the people of Cuba. Is that a legitimate argument?
Well, if you look around the third world, that is the former colonies of Europe around the world, in Africa, in South and Southeast Asia, in Latin America, most of them are not communist. Most of them are capitalist. And it would not be hard for us to simply look at a country like Haiti and say, oh, look, capitalism doesn't work. Capitalism has never worked. Haiti has always been eminently capitalist, and it's really poor. So I don't think that we should automatically associate capitalism with prosperity and communism with poverty, because we see many examples historically and globally where capitalism is also seems to coexist quite well with poverty and great inequality. I also think that it's very difficult to draw a broad conclusion like, oh, this system works or doesn't work. Again, I would just take us back to the United States. There have been many anti-government protests in the United States. That doesn't necessarily mean that people want to overthrow the entire political system of the United States. They want change. And clearly people in Cuba want change. But what I have heard people on the streets in Cuba talking about is we have no food, we have no electricity, and we have no vaccines. That's not all that different from what people in other parts of the third world are protesting about. If you look at what's happening in Colombia right now, people have no food, people have no land. The Cuban Revolution took place in 1959. These protests are happening in 2021. I think people are protesting about what's happening right now in Cuba.
Okay, so if I could, I just wanted to bring Ted back into the conversation. Ted, what are your thoughts on that whole debate then? Socialism versus capitalism, the example of Cuba versus the example of capitalist societies then?
I appreciate Avi's introduction of the nuance and the global comparisons. This is especially important when we're talking about the projection of U.S. power and the United States tradition of befriending very brutal, undemocratic regimes because it's in its interest. All of that is certainly true and needs to be part of this conversation. However, one of the things that's important to remember is all of the roots of Cuba's problems are accumulated over years, and they all have a political root, even if it's economic, even if it's scarcity, even if they're asking for bread, right? They're asking for freedom, and that starts with the political system. Everything in Cuba grows out of the political system, right? So economic problems are the result not just of an undemocratic communist regime that doesn't allow competition, doesn't allow free elections, right? But it's also the result of a command economy. Avi before made some examples of how capitalism has failed in many parts of the world, which is true, certainly. But it's very hard to find any comparable examples of communist economies that have been prosperous, right? Communism, in its essence, impoverishes. It tries to make everyone equal in a country by taking away many economic rights, but it ends up making them equally poor. And this is a joke that Cubans often will tell you about. There's another joke that Cubans will say that, what did the revolution accomplish? And someone will say, well, healthcare, sovereignty, education is what we accomplished. And then someone will say, well, what did it fail at? And they'll say breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And that failure has a political root. And remember, people in the street are certainly asking for medicine and food, but they're also asking for freedom, and they're asking for the government to stop dividing. I would agree that not everyone wants to overthrow the government in Cuba, for sure, because the government is the only game in town for many of the services that they receive and rely on. But they certainly want not just change, but I think they want fundamental change.
Silvia, what are your thoughts on the governing structure and whether or not that should be overthrown? I know that's a very, very heavy question, so I don't want to give a definite answer, but just your thoughts overall on the governing structure and how it's been ever since the revolution took place. And then B, I wanted to also ask you, there's been an argument on the part of many that the narrative when it comes to these protests in Cuba has been overtaken sometimes by a lot of misinformation and fake news, which has used, for example, rallies in Miami, which which were anti-Cuba as in governing structure by Cubans in exile in Miami, and were not in fact even in Cuba itself, or in some cases were in fact pro-revolution rallies, which were then somehow shown as anti-revolution. What are your thoughts on that?
I think Ted Henken did a good job of pointing out how deeply interrelated politics and economics are in a system like the one that Cuba has. And so when people have problems with one, they have problems with the other. It's not possible, in fact, to separate them. I think at this point in time with the protests, we need to listen to what people are protesting about and what they're telling you. I already spoke about Patria y Vida, the song that has become like the banner of the protests, and you can see it being held up on signs all over the protests. I think I've also seen people on videos going down the Malecón, the seaside, very beautiful avenue in Havana, shouting freedom, freedom, libertad, libertad. So this is not just economics, although economics is a very large part of it. I mean, last year, the Cuban economy contracted by minus 11% GDP, gross domestic product. So Cuba imports food at present. They import a lot of things they export very, very little. I mean, sugar has in effect ceased to be a Cuban export, and Cuba is only relying on tourism. And of course, tourism was very much hurt by the pandemic, as well as by the sanctions that Donald Trump imposed on Cuba. And so their sources of revenue have been minimal, okay? But they're also complaining about the extent of the government control over people's lives, okay? And they say that very clearly in the song Patria y Vida, as well as other signs that are being held up, and shouts of dictatorship, shouts of freedom, libertad. The Cuban government has always insisted that the opposition to the revolution were grupúsculos, meaning very, very, very small grupos, very, very small groups of people. Okay, and what these protests have shown is that the dissatisfaction is very widely spread. They took place throughout the island, 14 cities. They're very massive, and that's the first time that this has happened in 62 years.
Okay, Aviva, the final word before I let all three of you go. We just have about a minute and a half or so left. Is there light at the end of the tunnel for the economic crisis, as in the issues of that the Cuban people have, their grievances, do you think? Because, I mean, we're, as I said, the world is suffering through an economic crisis because of the pandemic, so it's not unique to necessarily Cuba, but yes, it's just much more exacerbated. Are reforms in order? Do you think that this current government is even capable of carrying those proper reforms out?
Well, I would just like to mention that, in fact, there have been numerous openings to capitalism in Cuba since the 1990s. That is what you call the command economy. It looks extremely different today than it did in the 1970s or 1980s. And some of what people are protesting is actually capitalism as it has spread in Cuba. Tourism, foreign investment, inequality, which is a result of the capitalist reforms where some people are able to benefit and some people are not, crumbling social service sector. And I also just wanted to mention that I think neither capitalism nor socialism, like they may exist as ideal types, but in the world today, they generally overlap. And has there ever been a country that has been wealthy and socialist? Well, just look at Scandinavia. The state sector in Scandinavia provides social services and covers sectors of the economy that is unknown in a place like the United States. And even in the United States, we have a state sector that provides services. So I don't think that the fact that a state sector provides services and that not all of the economy is privatized is necessarily a recipe for poverty and disaster.
There's a final comment, but we really appreciate Avi, Ted, and Silvia for putting this all into context first, or giving us viewpoints. We try to give you, a holistic viewpoint of what's happening there in Cuba, and it's important to be nuanced, as all of our guests are mentioned, as Avi they're mentioned even at the top. It's not an either-or type situation, right? Yes, even though, as Ted and Silvia they're mentioned, a lot of the chants on the streets are for liberty and are, in fact, very directly calling for the system, for a change in the system and systemic change to occur as far as the governing system goes. This is a lot. I mean, there's many issues at play here. Capitalist versus socialism might just be too simplistic a way to view it altogether. Nevertheless, as I said, during the pandemic, there's been this economic crisis that's been much more exacerbated in Cuba, and now all of the fault lines seemingly are now becoming that much more obvious. Will the Cuban leadership be able to deal with that? Will foreign interference / pressure make a difference? And how will all of this play out? We're going to keep a very close eye on this, of course, here in Scope in the coming days, months, and years. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.